Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the book launch of Taiping Tianguo. I am Freya. I am the new member of Parasite, the curator of education and the public programs. And today it's my honor to be here and join with the editors and the contributors of this publication. And later on, we will have a small discussion regarding this project and the book. Hi, Yong, and as one of our contributors. Yeah. So before we started, we would like to thank Robert Hall Foundation and Connecting Space to make this event happen. So before we start getting too much, and we would like to invite Doryun and Cosmin to introduce this project. Doryun.
Well, I have them. Yeah. So we were planning how we're going to do this about 2 minutes ago, and we thought it would be actually quite useful to not to really belabor the point and spend too much time talking about it. But Cosmin and I have talked about the origin and the development of this project like 1,200 times, so we're used to it, but we haven't done it in a while, and we shouldn't assume that people here know the story, so I thought maybe I will tell a short version of it, because at least I think two of us see it as a kind of beautiful coincidence, maybe serendipity, perhaps even destiny. So just to tell a quick story that's now almost 5 years old, I think it was sometime in 2010, I was in Hong Kong, and this was way before I moved to Hong Kong. I was working in New York, and I was at a conference organized by AA, co-organized by AA, about performance. And that was when I met Frocking. And of course, he's a well-known quantity here, but I was amazed, as anyone would be amazed and awed by the first encounter with Frocking. And then somehow I got to talk to him, and then sort of began to learn about who he is and also his history in New York, which was a topic that I was very much interested in general, what happened in New York in the 1980s, an incredibly important time in terms of diversity becoming the key word. And going back to New York, I started sort of digging into it a little bit more. The other characters of the four main artists of this exhibition, Ai Weiwei and Martin Wong and Tehching Hsieh, I was just developing different relationships with the artists, or in the case of Martin, who passed away in 1999, I was doing archival research on them, and started just developing this question of, did these four artists know each other? Because these four artists who happen to live in New York all at the same time are talked about in totally different contexts from one another. Again, Frocking, I didn't really know much about him. Ai Weiwei, I don't need any introduction, but he's such an important figure in the history of contemporary art, but in terms of Chinese contemporary art. But he's discussed, his New York years are always discussed in terms of it being sort of kind of gestational or formational period, right? Martin Wong usually talked about in the context of the East Village scene in New York, but also in the context of multiculturalism in Asian American art history. And Tehching Hsieh as a sort of the legendary figure in the history of performance art anywhere. So there was this question that I had, did they know each other? And I think almost maybe 6 months later or so, I was in Hong Kong, I think around the fair time, before it was Art Basel, Art Hong Kong, and it was some sort of a context where I was there, and then that's when Cosmin's appointment as the director of Parasite was announced, which I knew nothing about. And we had known each other a few years back, but I hadn't seen each other for a couple of years, and it was such a weird experience to see him in Hong Kong. And so I think the first thing that I said to him is, what the hell are you doing here? And that's when it was announced that he was going to be the director. Anyway, so during our stay, we talked about many different things, and one of the things that I just mentioned is that here's this interesting research topic that I've been thinking about, which is probably totally unrealizable in the form of exhibition at MoMA, which is where I was working at the time. But I think it is such an interesting topic. Maybe I want to do an essay or a book about it. And he looked at me and he goes, "Why don't you do an exhibition at Parasite?" So that was sort of the beginning of it. And so I think my response was like, well, that's such an irresponsible thing to ask. I said this was just a question. But then, then it quickly developed into something, an exhibition, and I was doing it as a sort of an independent project, separate from my day job at the time. So I think, the exhibition opened almost a year after that, so May 2012, and I've already spoken too long, so I think I'm gonna pass the microphone to Cosmin so that he can talk about how it just continued to roll around the world and really developed. And I guess maybe an important point that I would just make here is that it was really a question that was a speculative project, that was a kind of a side project that I was doing, trying to sort of reconstruct a history as much as I can. And what was really great about this evolutionary steps is that we were talking to more people, meeting more people, finding more archival sources, and the story filled itself out. And we'll get to that later, but what you see here in the form of publication is the final step of the evolutionary process.
Yes, indeed, it was quite a journey. Well, I'll pick up from that moment before the opening, actually, in Hong Kong, because the process of researching and of making this idea and these speculative connections into a show was quite an interesting one. And it was an interesting process because at the beginning we were open to more, to a significantly stronger degree of speculation and even of fiction, and I think that's what Doryun means when he said irresponsible, because, and that's also like what he means when he says that this is a show that wouldn't have, been able to do at MoMA, not because of the artists, but because of the nature of connections between them. Well, longer story. But I think primarily because of the connections of the and of the methodology employed in putting these artists together in an exhibition. Because Doryun mentioned that each of them are inscribed in very different narratives, art historical narratives, that have very few connections with each other. And in this, and we were basically starting from a supposition, of like what happens if we look at the biographies of these artists, and what happens, and we were also starting only from a few known connections. But then, so as Doryun mentioned, between Frocking and Tehching and Ai Weiwei. But then, Doryun, who was actually like working in parallel, I think you didn't mention that, on Martin Wong, the next step was like, well, what happens, if we make this association, for example, because, well, the only thing we knew was that they were hanging out in the same years, in the same universe of sorts. But then, while doing the research, while talking to these artists, we discovered more meaningful connections between them. And this is in a way the beauty, and this is a bit the kind of the extension of the serendipity or even of the destiny of this project, because I think the exhibition became more meaningful for a lot of the people involved. And I think the most, Martin, who was the unknown quantity, the figure that was brought into the project purely on speculative basis, proved to be somebody well known to Frocking. He was somebody that frequented his space, the space that Frocking opened in New York in the middle of the 80s. Frocking eventually unearthed from his incredible archive mountain of a pile of things in Cattle's Depot. He unearthed a photo of Martin wearing his froggies, wearing Frocking's froggies. But then the most touching moment was when we discussed with Ai Weiwei, when I went to Beijing to talk to him about this exhibition, and Martin seems to be a close friend of his during the New York Times, somebody with whom they had important conversations, and Martin in fact made a painting for him that seems to be somewhere. So in a way there was this process of this exhibition starting from a speculation, started from a fiction and becoming actually more art historically sound than our initial premise. Then the show itself became also like an interesting story in itself, and probably like a metaphor for many things, because after being, I think, quite a successful exhibition here in Hong Kong, it traveled into quite an interesting geography. So it went to Singapore first at the National University Museum of Singapore, where, which was a very interesting venue for it, because, you know, in a way this was an anti-museum exhibition and it was anything but a show for a museum. And then to see it and to stage it into the confines of a very interesting institution that is on one hand a very, I would even say like radical museum for Singapore, but actually still employing a lot of the aesthetics of a museum. So it was an interesting venue for it. Then it traveled to Istanbul at the SALT space. And then that was an interesting coincidence with the beginning of the Gezi Park movement revolution in Istanbul. So the space where it was shown at the SALT Beyoğlu is in the center of Istanbul, so 5 minutes walk from Taksim Square. So that space became part of the geography of those protests, of tear gas and of people congregating during those important months. And then that was an interesting parallel to some of the materials in the show. For example, the photograph that Ai Weiwei took in New York in the 80s, in the late 80s in Lower East Village, which were basically protests and riots against the gentrification that was happening in New York at the time. So it was an interesting parallel to the anti-gentrification, well, so to speak, riots that were occurring in Istanbul at the time. And then eventually it went to New York at the e-flux space, which was a very beautiful close of the circle, because the space of e-flux is actually in Lower East Side, East Village, so very close to where the stories in the exhibition actually took place. And I think this trajectory is also very much indicative of the historical nature of this exhibition, because this is something that we said several times, that this kind of itinerary for an exhibition generated in Hong Kong, traveling to Singapore, then to Istanbul and to New York would have been completely unconceivable a generation ago. This is simply not the way in which art exhibitions and many other forms of knowledge were simply circulating at any point in, human history. It sounds grand, but it's actually true, because it's in many ways indicative of a very different geography and a very different way of regions and cities and countries coming together, where, again, such an itinerary is in fact possible. And the 1980s, which is the subject of this exhibition, of this book, was probably the last decade of the old era, of an era when artists from different parts of the world, I mean in this case from different corners of the Chinese-speaking world, so to speak, would have to would aspire and would move to a place like New York, would go to, would have to move to something that was perceived as a capital of the art world in order to make it, in order to become a serious artist, as Martin Wong actually said. I mean, you know, I think also it's interesting that, you know, at the end, you know, during these 4 years, Doryun leaves a center like New York and moves to Hong Kong, to a new center. I mean, I shouldn't talk so much about us to become too self-referential, but I guess in a way, it's, you know, it's perhaps indicative of the same historical processes occurring. But I think I'll pass the microphone to Leslie now, who was our managing editor for the book, who can talk more about the actual item that we all have, object in our hands.
Okay, thank you. So in front of you, and I hope you all bought a copy already, is a labor of many here and not here. So we hope that this book not only can portray a bit of that atmosphere in New York at the time when the artists were there. So, I mean, I think later on some of the contributors will tell you about how their contribution fits in here. But I think another side of the book is to give a maybe more personal view on what life was like there. So I think, you know, the sort of background, how the genesis of the exhibition is clear, and then it sort of folds into a more art historical product. But sort of the friendship between the four artists, the relationship between the four artists and New York is a sort of key link that makes his book different from a normal sort of art historical treatment. So we asked, so for the only artist that is no longer alive, Martin Wong, we have two of his friends who worked with him very closely in San Francisco, or knew him in San Francisco, in New York, and mounted his first show, and also curators who contributed to their impression of Martin's sort of different stages, from San Francisco to New York and then back to San Francisco. And maybe some of you know that artist Yang Vo won the Hugo Boss Prize a few years ago at the Guggenheim. His work was based on an archival sort of research on Martin's collection of objects. So you'll see in the essays a very short sort of mosaic, I think that's the word that Doryun and Cosmin used, sort of a mosaic portrayal of this very eclectic artist and kind of a singular movement. Together, it's not been that long, but I need to go back on the content in my head. Yes, so we're going backwards. Martin Wong, and maybe I'll just cover the Tehching first, because we have two practitioners and curators. One is Xavier Leroy, who's one of the leading performance artists and choreographer, who was actually here in Hong Kong for the exhibition, right, for a performance. But he also was here for the Parasite conference on performance last year. So he sort of gave an overview of what he thought about documentation as part of the work. And you can see we reproduced Tehching's iconic 6 performances, the documentation of it, which he considers the best way to represent the work in the book. And Xavier's piece sort of talks about this infatuation and maybe fetishism of objects and documentation in today's view of performance. And Tang Fu-Kun, Bangkok-based, Singaporean-born curator who's of dance makers, he came with sort of a more theater point of view on how Tehching figures into his own practice. So you can see sort of different kind of treatments of artists, but we hope we can give you a different from what you already know from our historical or curatorial sort of channels. So I will pass on the mic to the other authors who wrote at length of their subject. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, so like Cosmin and Doryun has said, the exhibition is an extraordinary one because it's so unusual that the exhibition started with a speculation instead of a result of a research. So at the opening of the exhibition, I went to the opening, and actually I was very worried about them because because it was purely a speculation for me. Then at that point, the relationships between the four artists could be totally non-existent. Now we prove that it exists, right? But at that time we didn't know. It was a very new experience for me as a researcher for an archive. So I was paying a lot of attention to the things that were in the exhibition and trying to find evidence of interaction between them. Especially, I didn't know who Martin Wong was at that time. I never heard of this name before the exhibition, so it was very exciting. So when Cosmin came to me and asked me to write an essay for the exhibition, my response was, "Oh, good. So I will give you non-speculative things. So we give you history that is very, very sure." That's why I wrote a very historical essay about a bigger context about how Chinese artists moved to New York in the 1980s and how they survive and what kind of problems they face at the time in New York. It's actually a very interesting topic because in the early 1980s, not so many people can move from mainland China to the outside world. Maybe just less than 10 artists were able to do so, to move to America, and even less in New York. Ai Weiwei was one of them. And it's interesting because it's simply unimaginable for us today, the kind of shock they had at that time when they was moving from Beijing to New York, the difference of living standard, the living of understanding of everything, city and culture. The kind of shock is something that I'm very interested in to investigate. So I look at a lot of writings and interviews of people, of Chinese artists in New York at that time. And one sentence that come up with one of the interviews was that artistic freedom was important because that's the thing they seek for when they were in China. It was important, but then what? That's the problem that they face at that time. And now they're allowed to do everything. No one will stop them from doing abstract painting, loose painting, or crazy performance, but then they have so many choices that they don't know what to do. So at that time, they come up with different trajectories that is totally subjective. For Ai Weiwei, which is the protagonist for the exhibition and also for the essay, the path he chose was to do nothing, actually. He realized the only possibility after seeing so many things in New York, the only possibility of continuing making art is to do nothing. In the reference of Marshall Duchamp, of course, and Andy Warhol. So he spent a lot of time hanging around, gambling, hanging out with friends, drinking, but not making art. So that's the story of Ai Weiwei at that time. And I still think it's a very formative year of Ai Weiwei practice. It's because the important thing is not what an artist make an object, but what the artist project an identity of himself. That's pretty much the things that he's still doing today. And one thing in the essay is that I always think that the most important or the best test about Ai Weiwei as an artist is actually a novel that's written by his younger brother called Ai Dan, who spent 2 years in the 80s in New York with Ai Weiwei. And he was a novelist, so he wrote a short novel about life at Ai Weiwei in New York, and he explained a lot of thinking and actions of Ai Weiwei at that time. It's a pity that it has never been translated in English, so I translated a few passages in my essay in the book. So this is I guess this is an attracting point for the book, right? A selling point. I was trying to, I was trying to, I was trying to make it sellable. No, it's very sellable. It's a wonderful design and everything. Yeah. So I guess that's it. My essay, someone just told me that my essay is the most easiest, understandable one in there. I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
It is a compliment.
Many people tell me that. But I will pass to Christina and Yong.
Well, hi. My name is Christina. Together with Yong Ma, we were invited by Cosmin and Doryun to write about Frog King. And I think Frog King is one of the most misunderstood artists in the local art scene. And for us as quite young curators, we thought it would be a very interesting approach to look at the existing texts, writings on Frog King himself. And then on the other hand, Yong, since he was in Hong Kong and I was in Amsterdam at that time, which was quite a difficult way to co-write a text. So Yong was doing more interviews with Frog King and looking into his archive. So the way we kind of tried to structure this contribution was to kind of look at his biography and look at different trajectories of his work. We kind of divided it into 4 different phases. First in the 70s and 80s when he was starting to be an art teacher and how he started thinking about the notion of sculpture and calligraphy, and also his kind of influences from reading art magazines and kind of getting to know about conceptual arts, and how he also mixed it with his understanding of Taoism and Confucian. And then kind of moving on to kind of the New York period, which I think, our contribution really doesn't really focus on the New York period. It's more kind of looking at how that also kind of influenced his future kind of work at that stage. And so we also kind of, from our research, we found out a little bit more about his collaboration with Tehching Hsieh, how he was actually his assistant at that time and helped him on his performances. And from that, he also got to know a lot of different people. And do you want to talk a little bit, or I just feel like, because I feel like I'm going on my kind of like track. So yeah.
Well, I think you're right about things, I guess. But because to be quite honest, it was quite a long time ago. When we did the research, so I'm just trying to remember exactly kind of what happened. But what was interesting, I think, for me at the time, without really sort of realizing it, it was actually kind of the actual collaboration between Christina and I as well. I think, just how difficult it was in terms of writing the text together when she wasn't in Hong Kong and we were doing it through Skype and all that kind of things, like constantly all the time. So I think, that's sort of, sort of in the spirit of the exhibition as well as the book, in terms of collaboration, but in terms of artistic friendship as well. The other thing I think I would like to mention is that, so when I went to interview Frog King at his studio in Car Depot, which is sort of mentioned by Cosmin, and mountains of like research materials, and given my size, it's actually quite hard to get inside the building, to be quite honest, because it's basically, even to this day, this space is completely packed with things. So sort of I think before going in, I had the idea of sort of wanting to focus on his period, his time in New York, and trying to really sort of sort out the connections between the artist and him. But after a while, it became so quite clear that it wasn't quite possible to do so. And I think, and then I sort of, after sort of reading other materials as well, what I think was important was then to really focus on his lifelong practice instead of just what happened in New York. Of course it was important. I think it was a really exciting time for him, but also quite challenging as well. I think, he made a lot of friends and connections at the time, and it became so quite informative in terms how he practiced art after he returned to Hong Kong. But ultimately, I think it was sort of, it was almost like a responsibility in a way to actually have to write a text that's about his lifelong practice instead of just focusing on one sort of specific period of time, because that's something that's so kind of lacking, and as sort of mentioned by Christina, he's pretty much a misunderstood artist in a way, and I think his earlier sort of contribution to the arts in Hong Kong has always been, it was and still is really extremely important.
Probably to add to that, I think what our contribution also tried to do is to kind of understand his methodology. Because in a way, I mean, most people when they encounter Frog King, they kind of see him as some sort of wacky figure that comes in with a performance and asking people to wear froggy sunglasses or throwing things around. But then people are distracted by this action, but without understanding what is underneath that. So what we were trying to trace is that how he moved from the 70s and then going to New York, getting more exposure to this idea of performance art. Also, that is when he also adopted this Frog King identity in New York. So I think that was also quite instrumental for his current practice and when he came back to Hong Kong. So I think also to understand his vocabulary, because he also his work has a lot of terminology that is very much connected to his work, like frogism, hakbanam, different kind of terminology. So in a way that we're just constantly trying to locate these different words or terms that are actually very helpful for people to really understand where he's coming from, rather, and maybe also locating the logic, because in a way his work looks like it's very chaotic and doesn't really have a real order behind it, but actually there's, in his own way, he has his way of doing things. So in a sense, I think for both of us, we were trying to make sense of his work, and after this, and we really realized that, I think this is maybe an attempt, at least, to kind of like map how he, it's because Frog King is not an artist that you see one work and you understand what he does. His work is an ongoing kind of process. I mean, going from his gallery in New York, and now his museum project and his art institute, it is about creating a whole, I think in a sense, maybe it's a self-institution in a way that he talks about. He has his own vision on art, and he also wants to kind of like educate people to understand his practice. So education is also something super important to his work. So we just try to like connect all these threads to hopefully provide a more comprehensive kind of view or understanding on his practice. I guess that's it for now.
Yeah, thank you. With this really brilliant sharing and introduction of this book. So is any audience at sea has some questions to ask? No? Yes?
Are there other examples or models of this whole kind of like speculative kind of departure point for exhibitions, or is this the first one that you know of? Just because it is very interesting, it hadn't occurred to me that it's, that you can start an exhibition like this, and I'm curious if there are others.
I'm sure there are. Out there.
I saw examples in speculation, but they failed at the end. This is the first one that actually is able to establish a really like art historical narration after the exhibition. So I think it's quite.
Well, I think the way we use the word speculative at the beginning is a sort of honest acknowledgement of the fact that, we are putting it out there as a proposition because, we feel that it's more important to say that there is this possible narrative of relationships than spend 3 years doing full archival research and oral interviews and whatnot to prove that they actually knew each other, So it was both honest acknowledgement as well as it turned into a way of exhibition making. But I think at least for me, there was at least a certain gut feeling that even though I didn't substantiate that all four knew one another, right? But it was such a time in the 1980s that if you are Chinese American artist, right, an immigrant artist or any Asian American artist in New York, even though the community was of fair size, that they probably all knew one another. So I think the wild card really was Martin, because the other three are coming from mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So I was pretty sure that they knew one another. And Tehching and Ai Weiwei, we certainly knew because he's documented by Ai Weiwei's photos. Martin's a wild card because the third generation Chinese American born in San Francisco, didn't speak any Chinese. And he just, normally seen as this almost a self-taught outsider painter, right? So he wasn't even in the mainstream discourse of art. But somehow I thought that he could be an element that might actually connect them together. And also the difficulty with him was that because he's no longer alive, and despite this amazing archive, and that his now 95-year-old mother dedicated her life to documenting everything about his, the press and all his openings and whatnot, we couldn't use that to substantiate his relationships with others. So that archival process had to be done through oral interviews with other artists, which had to come later. But just to sort of find a different meaning, not right now, but I've been actually thinking about this, that there is the kind of speculative connection that was the motivation at the beginning in terms of the exhibition making, but I think that was also mirrored in our conceptualization of how this book should come together. So I guess already a year and a half ago or so, we were thinking about who's going to write on what topics. And those who are sitting here, I think we didn't really have to even debate so much about who to invite to write about these artists. We clearly knew that they were going to write about them, not because that they are known specialists on these topics or on these artists, but this just felt right. And as you can see here, that we're all curators and writers of certain generation, and we had already known one another, and our paths had crossed in different ways, even though now we all live here, but just until a year and a half ago, both of us were living in New York, and you also came from afar, and but so this exhibition and the resulting publication project also became a way of defining, at least for me, a community and the network of curators. And then, I say that we're of certain generation, looking back on this time when some of us, well, all of us were very young. Some of us were very young. But why is it that we are being interested in this time? I think it really says something about our own self-definition of this generation, choosing to live here, choosing to work here, and being engaged in the work of institution building, discourse building. And all of that now feels like it has solidified and came together in the form of a book. But this was a mosaic. The different pieces were being put together one by one. So we sort of kind of followed almost a gut instinct. So I can speak for myself that I am extremely happy that this just felt right to me, and that's why I use the word. It's not just serendipity, but sometimes even feels like even a destiny, not to sound so melodramatic about it, but at least personally, it just kind of finally came together in such a beautiful way.
Sorry, just really quick. were there any other artists that kind of popped up as like the glue, or other people in between these four figures that in your research kind of came up and you're like, oh, now that we've kind of looked into it, there are all these other kind of threads that actually, you know, had parallel ties or something like that? I mean, were there other people, or was it just this?
So other than these four people?
Yeah, that kind of formed this particular network or helped define this particular kind of geography and time period. Like, were there names that kept coming up that are not the subject of your?
Well, I think this is important because obviously, if this would have been an art historically appropriate show, then the selection would have been different, of course, and it would have definitely included a few other people, some of them, you know, key representatives of the, you know, Asian American art scene of the time, Chinese American art scene at the time. But I think it's exactly the method of this show that, for all the reasons that we already mentioned, that we arrived at this constellation of four individuals, and this was a given around which we constructed everything else, basically. So again, if we would objectively look at the stories, there are a number of other artists who played, you know, important, major, decisive roles in the worlds of these artists, in the worlds that are determined by these people. But it was not how the show was constructed. So once this constellation of four individuals was put together, then we moved around this given. And I mean, you know, in Anthony's text, you can get a more accurate sense of that. You can get a more, you know, complete and comprehensive idea of the Chinese American or Chinese diasporic scene in New York at the time, and some of the figures are present there. And then, you know, there are some people who also figure in Ai Weiwei's photographs as well. So that world is referred to in the project and in the book.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the title and the cover?
So, Taiping Tianguo was the title that was used by a painting, probably non-existent, no longer extant painting by Martin. And as I say, Martin was quite fully Americanized, more, you know, sort of Haight-Ashbury flower child than what you would typically remember as, you know, Chinese American from Chinatown. He's the product of that generation. But after he moved to New York in 1978 and became a full-fledged painter in the 80s and 90s, and it's later in the 90s that he made this painting using this word. I don't think he fully understood actually what the meaning was. I'm sure he knew that it was referring to Taiping Rebellion and, you know, all of those things. But anyway, so Mark Johnson, who is a scholar, San Francisco-based scholar who has dedicated to research and working with the Martin Wong estate for many years, or tried to organize this posthumous exhibition. I think it was back in 2003, just a few years after his passing from AIDS-related illness. And he was very much struck by Martin adopting the title Taiping Tianguo, you know? And the site of the exhibition was Chinese American Cultural Center. And then, you know, as some of you may know, that often diasporic communities are much more conservative than where they originally came from. And essentially, to make a long story short, the director of that center, I guess who had been the director for many years, flipped out and said, you know, over my dead body, you're going to use that as the title of this exhibition. So earlier on, Mark told me this story, and I thought there was such a beautiful resonance in the title beyond what that was. So first of all, to be able to use this title that was, you know, that had to be abandoned. Two, if you read the words literally, what it suggests, the utopia and the heavenly, you're right, the heavenly realm of eternal peace, So what that represents, what that means could be a great metaphor for, this really challenging time, which is the New York of the 1980s, which of course is the time and the scene of a vibrancy, multicultural, and this was the gays and lesbian artists could really be not really part of the mainstream, but no longer in the total shadow. But at the same time, the decade that was devastated by AIDS, right? So we decided to use that as a metaphor. So that's how it came together.
Lady, you have a question?
What was the emotional and intellectual response of the artists to be included first at the beginning when they heard about the project and when they saw a result?
Right. Well, frocking was, I think he was really delighted. I mean, he's an enthusiast. Yes, by by nature. So yeah, I think he was excited, but I think at the end it did become quite emotional for him, because we were in his space and we were going through photographs, and at the beginning he was showing me everything, and it's again frocking style that you need to do a kind of editing, or you need to push him to sort of like go to the direction that you want, and then the more this editing process was happening, I think the more emotional he was also getting, And I don't want to over speculate, but probably some of the things that he ended up showing me were he wasn't putting them forward in the first place because they weren't, his standard spiel of, this is what I did in the 80s, the frog is, this is who I am, my book, and so on. But they were things that were closer to his life through his biography and to something that is probably at a more intimate level also in his practice. So there was this sense of emotion. And with Ai Weiwei as well, he was, I could say, quite deeply touched about it. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to repeat, but he said things that, it's one of the most special group shows that invitations that he got, because it's such a striking association and this is so important for him, and these people were so important for him, and then that period, and he was extremely touched and as helpful and forthcoming for it. So we had great response and touching response from both of them. And I think you can talk about your discussion with Tehching and with maybe Martin's mother.
No, I think when I talked to him, because to be honest, I mean, I was expecting going in to do a 2-hour, 3-hour long interview. That was it. I was like going in after work, I'm leaving, done. No, it became 6 hours or something like that. Like I didn't leave Cal Depot until 2 in the morning. Basically, he couldn't stop talking. I think he just got really excited. I think that was sort of. I mean, I wouldn't call his reaction emotional, but he definitely got really excited. And the more he talked, the more he wanted to share, basically.
So I remember first going to Tehching Hsieh's studio / house, and I was a little bit careful because here's an artist who was never wanted to be seen as a Chinese artist, Chinese American or a Taiwanese artist, until just about a few years ago. I think it was that conference that I was talking about in Hong Kong in 2010, which was the first time that he spoke in Asia about his practice. And soon after, he gave a public talk in Taipei But you know, I mean, his practice was from 1978 to essentially mid 1980s, right? And then he essentially stopped making art. So he's this legendary figure. But you know, it took him another 30 years to even talk about this in his hometown. So you know, here's an artist who's very much conscious about his place in art history and how he wants to be written about. I don't think he has any problem being called throughout this time a New York artist, but he didn't want to be a Chinese artist, right? So knowing that, I was quite careful going to him and say that I want to put together an exhibition of 4 Chinese artists, you know? I mean, that's not how I said it, but essentially that's what it was. So I think he was definitely taken aback at first, but then I did explain to him that, you know, this is why, you know? Like I totally understand that all 4 of you are from different contexts, written about in different contexts, but I knew that at least some of you knew one another. I knew definitely that you knew Ai Weiwei, and you know, that's not the base of the exhibition, but that's the starting point of the exhibition, and I think it can tell a different story that's not usually talked about. And then he very well understood where the intention comes from. Again, in Martin's case, since he's no longer living, I spoke with his mother a number of times, and she was very easy. You know, she said, "Oh, Martin always wanted to be Chinese." But you know, I mean, it's funny, but I think it really speaks something else to it. You know, in a really deep and profound way.
And I mean, to go back to some of the conversations with Frog King, and also to break a bit this emotional, you know, part of it. I mean, these people had also hard lives at times in New York. I mean, that wasn't easy. You know, they were poor for most of the time, and they had to do shitty jobs for, you know, a long period of time to support themselves. So this also came up in the conversations, and you know. Frog King and Tehching worked in the same Chinese restaurant at some point, like in cleaning and washing dishes. So, and apparently the boss was an asshole. So, you know, things like that also came up, and you know, not only the mythical Taiping Tianguo, you know, nature of those times.
So, any questions? No. Yeah. So I think, yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks our lovely contributors and the speakers. So we will have some books here and drinks here as well. So enjoy it, and you can also purchase this book that was distributed by Sternberg and online and everywhere. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm sorry. Next week, Parasite would have a new opening of the show at our new space. So welcome everybody to come in. And our curators are here, Cosmin, Costinas, and Anthony Young. Thanks everybody. I'll see you next week.